Hi, Pathfinders. I hope that you're all doing well, or as well as you can under the circumstances. Talking to you this way is starting to feel a little bit like a normal part of my routine, and that's certainly not where I thought that we would be 3 weeks ago. But I'm excited to share Esther chapters 4-7 with you today, and I want to remind you that we're praying for you, and we're here for you if you need us. When we left Esther last week, Esther and all of the Jews in the Persian Empire were in a bit of trouble because Haman had just acquired a decree saying that all of them were going to be killed. So Esther and Mordecai get together, and Mordecai begs Esther to intercede for the Jews and to ask the king to help them. At first, Esther was really, really reluctant to do this. She reminds Mordecai that she can't just walk into the king and say, "Hey, I need a favor from you." In fact, if she goes into the king uninvited, the king can simply order her to die, unless he extends his scepter and gives her permission to keep living. So Esther reminds Mordecai of this, and let's look at Mordecai's response, and that's in verses 13 and 14. Mordecai says, "Do not think that because you're in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. If you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." Now, I love two things about this statement. First, let's look at Mordecai's faith. He doesn't say, "Help me, Esther, you're my only hope." He's convinced that God is going to rescue the nation of Israel in one way or another. It might be through Esther, but if Esther doesn't step up, he's convinced that God is going to save them through another way. Esther is not his only hope. God is. Second, Mordecai points out that if Esther steps out in faith, she'll have the chance to see how God can redeem what was, until this point, a really sad and lonely and broken story. She was an orphan who was forced into a bigamous marriage with a dangerous man, and until this point, her story's been pretty tragic. Mordecai is encouraging Esther to put that story in God's hands and see what God can do with it. And that's what Esther does in another beautiful response of faith. She says, "I will go to the king, even though it's against the law. And if I perish, I perish." So she puts her story and the ending of her story in God's hands. And let's see what God does with it. Well, in chapter 5, Esther goes to the king, who not only lets her live, but says that she can have whatever she wants, up to half the kingdom. Esther doesn't take half the kingdom, or doesn't even demand that her people live. She simply invites the king and Haman to a banquet. The king agrees to go, and while they're at the banquet, the king once again offers Esther pretty much anything she wants, up to half the kingdom. And all Esther does is invite them to yet another dinner. Haman leaves this banquet in high spirits. He's just been invited to a private audience with the king and the queen. Not many people get that. But he becomes angered because on the way out of the palace, he passes Mordecai, who once again refuses to bow to him. He goes home and he complains, and I'm going to give you what I use when we're reading Exodus to the girls, my whiny Israel voice. So he goes and complains to his family, and he says, "Oh my goodness, all this riches and all this money and all this power that I have, it doesn't mean anything because Mordecai won't bow to me." That's the Israelites' complaining voice. But he basically says, what good is all of this? What good is all this power and this money and these riches that I have if Mordecai won't show me honor? So his family convinces him of yet another great idea and says, "You should build this pole in the courtyard, and you should have Mordecai impaled on it. And just go to the king tomorrow and ask him to impale Mordecai." This makes Haman feel much better, so he goes to bed, and the next morning he gets up to go and see the king. But as we see in chapter 6, the king the next morning is not in a position to want to kill Mordecai. In fact, the night before, the king had been having trouble sleeping. And so one of his servants started to read him the book of Chronicles. Always a good plan when you can't sleep. And when that happens, he's reminded of a time when Mordecai saved his life. We read about that earlier in chapters 1-3, although I didn't talk about it last week. And he decides he wants to do something special to honor Mordecai. So when Haman comes in that morning, he says, "Haman, what should I do for the man that the king delights to honor?" Haman stops and thinks about it and says, "Well, I can't think of anyone more honorable than me." So he comes up with the plan of what he would want done for himself. And he says, "King, let's have a horse that you've ridden and robes that you've worn and a ring and jewelry that you've worn and put them on this man, who Haman thinks is Haman, and have him led through the streets by one of your most trusted servants, and have that servant shout, 'Thus shall be done to the man the king delights to honor.'" The king loves this idea and says, "All right, that's a great idea. Haman, go do that for Mordecai." Haman is, of course, really, really angry and horrified by the experience of leading Mordecai through the streets and shouting his praises. He gets into even a worse scenario when he goes to Esther's second banquet. Because at the banquet, the king once again says, "Esther, what do you want? I'll give you anything up to half my kingdom." And Esther says, "I just want you to save me and my people from the person who's planned to kill us." And the king gets angry and says, "Who is this person?" And the queen points and says, "It's Haman." The king is outraged and ultimately orders that Haman be killed on the very same pike that was built to kill Mordecai. And that's the end of the story for this week. You'll note that things are still a little bit messy. We still have that pesky order that all Jews have to die that hasn't been revoked because it can't be. And we haven't really solved all the problems that Esther and her people are facing. But we can start to see that even when it didn't look to everyone like God was working, he was working for the redemption of his people, even when they couldn't see it. So here are some things that I thought maybe we could take away from this week's reading. First, it doesn't look like God used Esther or Mordecai because they were particularly virtuous or followed the law all the time or were even particularly talented. In fact, these were Jews who had the chance to go back to their homeland and their temple, and they chose not to, although we don't know why. God used these two people not because they'd followed all the rules or because they were particularly strong or virtuous people, but because they were willing to take big steps of faith. They were willing to trust God with their broken and messy stories, and even when they couldn't see it, trust that God would work everything out in the end and work redemptively. Second, I think the important thing to take away is that God can take even tragic stories like Esther's and redeem them for good. Now, that doesn't mean that the stories somehow become less tragic or that the sadness just goes away. It just means that the stories of sadness are transformed, and out of those stories of sadness, you see the growth of hope and love and forgiveness. And I'm not going to be able to say it better than this, but this week last week, I got an email from Clare House, which is a hospice center that helps families in the last 30 days of the life of a loved one. So kind of in the 30 days leading up to a person's projected time of death, they provide a home for that family to stay in and be comfortable as that person transitions out of this life. But anyway, the email said this: "Our guests exist in the face of challenges that upend their daily lives, destroy routines, and reorder priorities as they deal with approaching death and devastating loss. They learn to relinquish control and live fully in the moment, as the changes force them to explore what matters most. Many become grateful, not for the loss and the pain, but for the challenges that forced them to reconsider how they live, and if it is supporting their core values." I hope that in the midst of this uncertainty, you have the courage to step out in faith and hand your mess to God and say, "Take this and make something beautiful." And while you may never be grateful for the pain or the loss that you or others around you might be feeling, I hope that when God reveals his plan for your particular mess, you find that you are grateful for how this changes you, changes how you live, and how God's making use of your particular mess. That's my prayer for you. So when you find out how God is making use of your story, please let me know. And for those of you who are curious about my mess that I mentioned last week, the kids who were taken into foster care and I didn't feel like it was the right thing to do, well, it took nearly 6 months for the judge to agree with me that those kids deserve to go back to their mom. And 6 months is a long time, and I felt really bad for the kids the whole time because I felt like they deserved to be with their mom, and that's just a long time to be away from your mom. But 6 months is also a long time to build a friendship, and that's what happened with me and this mom. And she got to know me, and I got to know her, and we lean on each other, and we talk to each other about our problems. And right now, when her daycare is closed and she can't work because it's really hard to work when you have 3 kids and no childcare, I'm able to help her, and I know that she'd do the same for me. And I don't think that would have happened, and that's a beautiful thing. But if God had given me what I wanted in my timeline, that's not where we'd be right now. There's a song I like called Unredeemed, and I'm pretty sure that I can sing at least this part of it without violating any copyrights. But if I do, I'm sorry. I tried reading it and it just didn't work. So it goes like this. The cruelest world, the coldest heart, the deepest wounds, the endless dark, the lonely ache, the burning tears, the bitter nights, the wasted years. Life breaks and falls apart, but we know these are the places where grace is soon to be so amazing. It may be unfulfilled, it may be unrestored, but when anything is shattered that is laid before the Lord, just watch and see. It will not be unredeemed. I don't know what God has planned to come out of this coronavirus, but I do believe that God will redeem even this. So have faith and trust that God is right here with you in the mess, working redemptively. Just watch and see. Until next time.